I'm Dan Seawolf, representing the York County Historical Committee, sponsors of this celebration, this commemoration today. I want to welcome everyone here for coming out on a beautiful, typical middle of November day in Virginia. And I also want to especially recognize Ms. Sheila Knoll from our Board of Supervisors. She representing the Board of Supervisors for us tonight. One thing I also want to do is mention a question came up to me a few days ago about Veterans Day and the spelling of Veterans Day. Someone an apostrophe after the N in veterans, someone an apostrophe after the N or the S in veterans. So I did a real quick research on it and said, basically while the holiday is printed as Veterans Day or Veterans Day, apostrophe in either place, in calendars and advertisements, the United States Department of Veterans Affairs website says the attribute, no apostrophe, rather than the possessive case is the official spelling because it is not a day that belongs to veterans, it is a day to honor all veterans. And we want to keep that in mind as we go through our service today, the commemoration. And now, if you would please rise for our invocation.
Today we are here to honor those that have served our country and those that have also given their lives so we may stand here and still live in freedom. We need to be constantly reminded of our gift of freedom and of those who gave us all to make sure future generations continue to know life in a free, democratic society. Remembering those who have passed is only half of the task that is before us today. We must also carry their love, honor, and duty forward to the future generations. Our children must know who they were, what they did, and why they did it. To do anything less will be a disservice to their sacrifice and their memories. Those that are gone created a clear pathway for us to continue on. We must never waver from their path of freedom and democracy. Take their memories, take their dreams, and walk forward, shouldering the cause of freedom. Carry it high and proud. They did, and now you must walk forward for them and for our children. Thank you. You may be seated. We try to do things to humanize the experience of our troops, those that served in the different conflicts. And today we're going to concentrate a little bit on the Second World War and talk about their sacrifices. And the guys that came from a regular life, many of them drafted to serve in the Second World War, and they came home and they went back to build the society back. And these include some very famous people that were famous after the war, and then just the regular guys that came back, started a business, went to work at a shipyard or wherever and became part of our society. The two men that you see up on the front are two images we have of York County citizens, but we don't know who they are. We just know they're citizens of York County, so I always like to feature them so they are not forgotten. Our first portrait, so on your left is the Beach Battalion for the USS Sheridan. The Sheridan was an APA that carried Marine contingent for naval landings, They did Tarawa, Saipan, Tinian, Okinawa, to mention a few. And the fella sitting sort of left center with his hands folded, John F. Smith, Jack Smith, served on the Sheridan. He served right after Tarawa through the rest of the war, and then came back home, went back to work. The fellow on the right also served on the USS Sheridan, and many of you may recognize him as Eddie Albert. Although when I talked to Jack Smith about it, he said, well, we didn't know him as Albert. He had a different last name. His last name is a Dutch last name, but his stage name is Eddie Albert. And he said one time, he said, you know that fellow that on Green Acres, he was one of our officers. I said, Eddie Albert? And he said, yeah, that was his name. But we didn't know him as Albert. So anyway, the small world, they were both on the same ship. The photograph on the left was taken on the Sheridan. The Beach Battalion, the only casualties taken by the Sheridan by naval personnel were in that Beach Battalion, and two of the men seated with Jack in there were killed in action at Saipan. Now we'd like to have the colors posted. Our local VFW Post 824 will post our colors if everyone would stand. Okay. If everyone will remain standing. Now we will have the national anthem.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
If everyone would remain standing, now we'll have the posting of our service flags by York High NJROTC unit. I pledge of allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. You may be seated. Portrait number 2 is a York County citizen. Floyd Jefferson Carter grew up in York County. He became one of the Tuskegee Airmen. He won the Medal of Honor during the Second World War. He also served in Korea and in Vietnam. And after all that, he served for 26 years as a detective in the New York City Police Department. He just passed away in 2018, but we're honored to have him as having been one of our citizens. U.S. Marine Claude Lewis Pitcher, and he's interesting. He lived in Seaford when I knew him, and his daughter's a good friend of mine. Claude Lewis Pitcher started as a Navy Seabee in the Second World War. Somehow he ended up in the Marines, and after he got out, after the Second World War, he went into the United States Air Force, so he was the 3-service veteran. He's the guy that's on our left. On our right, some of you may recognize United States Marine Lee Marvin. And Lee Marvin, when he, with everything he accomplished as an actor in his life, when he passed away, all he wanted on his tombstone, he has a military tombstone with the words United States Marine on it. So just to show you the type of person he was and what that service meant to him. He was wounded in action in the Pacific while he was at war. Our next portrait, portrait number 4, Meredith Eugene Edmondson. Mr. Edmondson, if you ever were down at the waterfront, in the old waterfront when they had a barber shop down there, Mr. Edmondson was the barber. Mr. Edmondson was also a Navy Seabee. So he served, he trained at Camp Perry, served in the Pacific with the Seabees, came back home, went back into the society as a businessman. The fellow on the left, or your right rather, some of you might recognize as Johnny Carson. Johnny Carson, United States Navy officer, and a lot of the guys back in the Second World War that were Navy were listed as reserves. So everybody that was either drafted or went in that wasn't regular Navy prior to the war was, if you look up any of their stuff, they're listed as a reserve officer, although they were all active duty. Anyway, I watched a YouTube clip, which you can find easily, and it's Johnny Carson, U.S. Navy, Ed McMahon, his sidekick, United States Marine, retired as a colonel, and Jonathan Winters, the comedian. And he was a United States Marine. So the three guys are sitting there talking about their service in the war. And of course, Winters, being the comedian he was picking on Ed McMahon because he was an officer, and Winters was enlisted, and that goes around quite a bit. Yeah, how many of you guys are officers? I know there's a lot of veterans here. And how many of you are enlisted? So you guys know what we're talking about. So. Our next portrait, Portrait 5. On the left is Thomas F. Brooks. He's in the center of the photograph, posing with his brother and sister. And he served the Italian Theater of the United States Army Air Corps, or Army Air Force, which of course became the regular Air Force, I think around 1947. Does that sound right, Sheila? Yeah. Anyway, but on the right is a two-war veteran, Ted Williams, the famous baseball star. Ted served as a pilot in the Second World War, and he got called back to action as a pilot in the Korean War. And didn't seem to affect his baseball career because all of his memorabilia is still worth a lot of money. Anyway. Portrait 6. On the left, Robert Davis Hawkins. He lived in Acre Acres. Son's a friend of mine, U.S. Navy. On the right, Lee Van Cleef, famous actor. Did a lot of westerns, and he was another guy that, of all the things he accomplished in his life, his military service was one of the things he thought so much of, that he thought was one of the most important things he did. Right now, we're going to recognize our veterans. We're going to start a piece of music, and I have to go up here to do that. And when it starts playing, we like all the veterans, and including yourself, all veterans to come forward, and the historical committee is to recognize you with a flower. So if our veterans would come forward.
She walked to the mailbox on that bright summer's day, found a letter from her son in a war far away. He spoke of the weather and good friends that he'd made. Said, I've been thinking about Dad and the life that he had. That's why I'm here today. And then at the end said, you are what I'm fighting for. It was the first of his letters from war. She started writing, you're good and you're brave. What a father that you'll be someday. Make it home, make it safe. She wrote every night as she prayed. And late in December, a day she'll not forget. Oh, her tears stained the paper with every word that she read. It said, I was up on a hill, I was out there alone when the shots all rang out and bombs were exploding. That's when I saw him, he came back for me. And though he was captured, a man set me free. And that man was your son. He asked me to write to you. I told him I would, oh, I swore. It was the last of the letters from war. And she prayed he was living, kept on believing, and wrote every night just to say, you are good and you're brave. What a father that you'll be someday. Make it home, make it safe. Still she kept writing each day. And then 2 years later, autumn leaves all around. A car pulled in the driveway and she fell to the ground. And out stepped a captain where her boy used to stand. He said, Mom, I'm following orders from all of your letters, and I've come home again. He ran in to hold her, dropped all his bags on the floor, holding all of her letters from war. Bring him home. Bring him home. Bring him home.
And if everyone would stay up there a minute, how many out there have relatives that are in the service right now? Raise your hand. Okay. Or have had relatives in the service? Raise your hand. See, almost everybody in here is connected. And now, I always like to start a fight before we leave. How many of you folks were Army, United States Army? Marines. No Marines today. Navy. Air Force. A lot of Air. Coast Guard. All right. We're just short Marines today. I don't think anybody in this room didn't have a connection to someone that either had served or is serving in the military at this time. All right, portrait 7. On the left is Elvin Roten from Grafton, serving the United States Army Air Force in the Second World War. And on the right, some of you may recognize, some of you may not, also United States Army Air Force is Van Heflin, another actor, did a lot of westerns, did a lot of different things, and another guy that, of all the things he accomplished in his life, he thought his military service in the Second World War was at the top of it. Anyway, at this time we'd like to do the laying of our wreaths, and our first wreath will come in, is from the Comte de Grasse chapter, National Society Daughters of the American Revolution. And Sarah's going to present that. Our next wreath, Disabled American Veterans, Chapter 13. Terry's going to present that for us. And our next wreath, Morehouse Society, Children of the American Revolution. Tony and, is it Ben? Brendan. Brendan's going to present that for us. And we're lucky to have such a fine group of students that celebrate that particular group that recognize their history. And if everyone would stand, we'll do the national taps. If you get a chance when you're going outside, when you're leaving, we have a monument out front, and those are to the veterans that didn't return. So you can go around and see a lot of similar names from the different conflicts or generations that became citizens have sacrificed their lives for our freedoms. Our next portrait, Levias Langford Williams. And he was in the Navy Seabees, and his son told me that Dad said he kind of had it made. He was in the Seabees, but he was posted to the Caribbean. So, and I probably met his dad as we grew up and didn't get a chance to know him. But one of the things revisiting these photographs is finding out, you know, these humble men came back and did what they did and had gone off to 2 or 3 years of this terrible conflict. But they came back home. And as many of you may recognize the fellow on the right, Ernest Borgnine. This is one of the McHale's Navy, but this is one of the few photographs where he's in his real Navy uniform, because he was in the Navy prior to World War II and then served in the Second World War, and of course then he came back later on and portrayed PT boat commander, although I think during the war he wasn't in PT boats. But anyway, a tremendous person, tremendous actor, and any interviews you ever heard, he talked about his military service prior to becoming well known as an actor. Our next one is the fellow on the left, Earl Bircher Fox. Earl Fox is buried in Normandy at the cemetery that you see in Saving Private Ryan. Earl and his brother, both Clyde Fox, are both buried there. Clyde died in the Hedge Road fighting after the invasion of Normandy. Earl was on a troop ship with the 66th Division, the SS Leopoldville, and the Leopoldville's job was to ferry troops from England over to Europe to Camp Lucky Strike, which is the main base camp that they used prior to sending the troops out. And one of the regiments of the 66th was all posted on the Leopoldville, and she was hit by German E-boats and sunk. And they didn't reveal till years after the war the loss of life, but it was almost 700 American soldiers went down. Earl was one of 7 Virginians that died on the Leopoldville, and he's the only body that was recovered. And he's buried in Normandy by his brother. And that sinking took place Christmas Eve or Christmas Day of 1944. So if you ever get curious about it, look up the SS Leopoldville. At this point, and on the right, Earl's story is very interesting. On the right, many of you may recognize James Arnez from Gunsmoke. And James Arnez was in the 3rd Division in Europe, served through Italy and France, and he was wounded. So if you ever watch any of the Gunsmoke episodes, he has a little bit of a limp, and he would have trouble apparently getting on the horse sometimes because of it. It was a bad leg wound. But what many of you don't know is how many of you have heard of Peter Graves, the actor? Peter Graves and James Arnez are brothers. And Peter Graves' real last name is Arnez. Spelled a little bit different. I think they changed the spelling of their name. And his brother served in the Second World War also. Peter Graves was an Army Air Force, U.S. Army Air Force veteran. At this point, we'd like to retire the colors. Our last portrait number 10, on the left is William Baker Wainwright. William Wainwright served in the U.S. Army Air Force. He was from Seaford. Served, came back from the war. One of those guys that's never talked about his service. The fellow on the right is Gene Roddenberry from Star Trek fame, you know. So, and he was also U.S. Army Air Force, and I believe he served in the Pacific. And so we got a lot of folks out there in athletics, acting, and politics that served the military and then came back home. And Eddie Albert and Ernest Borgnine were in the actually doing things prior to the war. Eddie Albert already had an acting career, but he chose to go in the Navy and go active duty. He could have just done war bond films, but he chose to go to the Pacific, and he was actually decorated for his action in Tarawa during that invasion. If everyone would stand, we'll do a closing prayer. This is called It Is a Soldier by Charles M. Province. It is a soldier, not the minister, who has given us freedom of religion. It is a soldier, not the reporter, who has given us freedom of the press. It is a soldier, not the poet, who has given us freedom of speech. It is the soldier, not the campus organizer, who has given us freedom to protest. It is the soldier, not the lawyer, who has given us the right to a fair trial. It is the soldier, not the politician, who has given us the right to vote. It is the soldier who salutes the flag, who serves beneath the flag, and whose coffin is draped by the flag, who allows a protester to burn the flag. While you're standing, I'd like for you to look at this last image. And it shows a group. It's usually misidentified as a D-Day photograph of D-Day landings, but it's actually from Operation Torch, one of the first invasion landings we did. And it just gives you an idea of how young these guys were. But anyway, it just, and you wonder when you see something like this, how many of these guys made it all the way through the next 3 years. So anyway, we appreciate you all coming. Dan's going to make a couple more comments.
I just, every year we do this. This is the first year that we've had a ceremony. I lost my younger brother December 26th last year. He had some injuries when he was in Vietnam. I will tell you, and I said before, when I went to Vietnam, I went just 2 years after he returned. My older brother was already there. My dad accused me of trying to give our mother a heart attack. 3 of us gone. My dad served in the Pacific. Fortunately, he came back. I want to say, in the portraits we have up here, I'm reminded of one with which I am more familiar. You might hear of Jimmy Stewart,
Yes.
or James R. Stewart. He's one of the founders of the Air Force Association. My dad knew him personally. Jimmy Stewart retired as I believe, a major general in the Air Force Reserves. He spent some time in the Pentagon. My dad worked with him on occasion. So we used to hear Dad tell stories about, yeah, he's a great guy. He's an actor. But he's also an Air Force general. But that, Ms. Knoll, please come up and make some words.
I'm going to make some noise.
Make some.
What I want to say is thank all of you for your service. Those of you who are thinking of service, do think of it, please. Because I think the service is, we say so many is the backbone of the country, but you're the heart and the hand of the country. You've kept us free all these years. And I have to thank the Historical Committee, because the Historical Committee keeps our history alive and reminds us what went before so that we will not go through it again in the future. And I also have to say I see many people in here who might be interested in becoming members of the Historical Committee. Please, if you have any inkling to be part of the Historical Committee, they do so much for this county, and we really could use your help. So please volunteer. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mrs.
We didn't. But anyway, thank all of you for being a part of this today. All right, be safe going home.